In this demonstration video, I'm going to show you how Ultra Workflow works, and not so much about how the product itself works, but how we can write custom workflows using this product that run periodically. You can think of the product more or less as a scripting engine that can run VB.NET scripts on a periodic basis or triggered from some other UltraRad products. So, and really the only prerequisite is to know a little bit of VB.NET, but I'm going to show you some VB.NET in this video, and we're going to start from the very, very beginning with the product. So starting with absolutely nothing. And you can see when you install Ultra Workflow, and really installing the product is pretty simple. You create the folder structure. So here we have, I put mine in C, UltraRad. So in my C drive I have an UltraRad folder and then Ultra Workflow. And then I have a bin directory, and inside that bin directory is all the files we need, which you can just paste in here. You don't even need to use an installer really. And once this is all put in place, there is a configuration file for the product, which I'm going to find here. So it's a config file. This is it right here. So this is where you configure all the options for the product. So if I go through this little list here, the important things are there's a work folder that you have to configure the path for. There is a setting here for the database connection, but it's not required to use this. So you don't have to have a valid database connection string. The product will work fine without the database connection string. It is better practice to use it, otherwise the logging can get a little weird. And then finally, well, not finally, but there's also a directory for the log files. So this is where you're going to find the logs. So when you write scripts and they don't work, or if you want to see what's going on with a script, obviously you're going to want to look in the log file, and that's the path to the log file. And in the other important configuration, all the way down here, this is the workflow descriptions file. So basically, the workflow engine, you have to tell it which scripts are going to be run and when and how often, or how they're triggered. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes, but that's how that's where you're going to set the path to all of your scripts and how they run and all the references and so forth. And I'll show you how to do that here in just a few minutes. That's pretty much all the main important settings in this file. That's the basic ones that will need to be set when you install it. There's a whole bunch of other options in here. One other one that is important I want to mention is the SQL timeout. So the SQL library that's used by Ultra Workflow, so when you're going to use Microsoft SQL Server with a workflow script, which is one of the nice things about using Ultra Workflow is we can interact with databases and things like that. There is the default timeout is 30 seconds. So if any transaction with the database is going to take more than 30 seconds, then you're going to have to increase that to a different value. When you have a timeout in the database, it's going to throw an exception. You'll see an exception in your log. It'll be kind of generic. It'll say null reference exception, but a lot of times you'll have to look for that for SQL transactions that take longer, and obviously you'll use logging to try to determine that. So let's take a look at actually writing a workflow script. So our first step to writing a workflow script is we need to create this workflow descriptions file. Now this is just an XML file. So it's really just a basic XML file. And as you know, any XML file always has to start with that little header for XML. And the rest is just basic XML. So we're going to have the element in which we put our workflow script. So we have a workflow descriptions tag. And inside that, you're going to put a reference to your actual workflow. And I'm just going to paste one in here so you can see what it looks like. So here's my workflow. The only thing that's in here, that I kind of left in here as default is that the two references. So these are two DLLs that are referenced. There's the system.dll and Microsoft.visualbasic.dll. These are all part of VB.NET. So these are VB.NET DLLs. These are libraries that let you do some just very basic things with VB.NET. Then you've got these other parameters which I haven't filled in yet. But what I want to do is let's step over to a demo script. So this is an example of a workflow script. Doesn't look very complicated, right? This is really simple right now. There's not much in here. But let's say I wanted to just write a script. We're going to write our first script, and the way the Ultra Workflow works, so this is a class that gets called by Ultra Workflow. So this gets, when Ultra Workflow starts, it pulls in all these scripts and they're compiled on demand. And the function that gets run by Ultra Workflow is the process function. So inside your Ultra Workflow script, you have this process function. And that's what actually is going to get spawned by Ultra Workflow when the script is triggered. Either that triggering could happen because somebody called it from a web service, like from a broker or something like that, or it could be just a periodic, it's running every 10 seconds, Workflow is going to run that script and have it do stuff. So when you run the script, you're going to get passed in an object of resources. So that's an object, and then you're also passed in vlog, which is what does logging. And really, the logging right now is the only mechanism we have to kind of work with this script. So I'm going to use the logging vlog to output some stuff in this script, just to do something really basic. So let's put a log line in here. So in order to use a function, really this is a method. So we already have access to the method because it gets passed into our script, right? So this is provided to our process function, right? So these are the arguments that are accepted by that process function. We're going to get, so when process gets run, inside our script we have access to resources and to vlog. I'm not going to talk about resources yet. We'll get to that in a little bit. But we are going to use vlog. Well, one of the vlog is basically is an object, and one of the methods available to us in that object is going to be write event. So write event is going to write a log entry. So we have to pass 4 arguments into that method. And again, this is not a VB.NET method. This is something provided to you from the Ultra Workflow service. So basically, you can pass back to the Ultra Workflow service log entries so that it can handle the logging for you. We could theoretically do our own logging, right? So we could, get a library that can write files out to disk, and we could create our own logs if we wanted to. But I'm going to use the mechanism that's part of the Ultra Workflow engine instead. So we're going to write a log entry. The first item is going to be something generic. I don't know. We'll just call this one test logging. That's going to be our first argument. The second is more details, right? So these are specific details about that log item. And really, these are very open. You can really put anything you want in these first 2 arguments. I'll show you what it looks like in the log entries here in just a second. So the second thing I want to put in is, I'm just going to put hello world, because that's what we always do for our first foray into programming. Kind of an old tradition. Then we're going to put the thread type. So I'm going to put in here test as the thread type. And finally, we put the level for the log entry. So I'm going to put 0 for the level for the log entry. Now I'm going to copy this, and I'll make a couple other versions of it just so you can see some variations, right? So maybe we'll make the second one a 1, and we'll make this one a 2 so you can see the difference. So 0 would normally be just informational logging. 1 is something, typically something a little more serious, and then 2 is the most serious log entry. Something really went wrong, and you'll see when we start doing conditionals and things like that, where we would start to use those different types of log entries. This really just makes it easier for you to look at the log entries in the log files. So let's give this a try. So I'm going to save this, right? So I've saved this script file. By the way, I've saved it in the bin directory. So by default, you want to make sure you put all of your script files in the bin directory. They don't have to be. You can really put them anywhere, but as best practice, we usually do that. Some of our customers, we place them in a SAN or a shared location, which is fine as well. But I usually try to put them in the same directory as the workflow descriptions file. That way it's all together. So I'm going to copy the full path to my clipboard. That way I can put the path to that file in my config file. So now it's good. It knows this is where my file is, and I'm going to call this sample. So that's the name of my script. I'm just going to call it sample, and my sample script's going to run every 10 seconds. So that easy. Just every 10 seconds, it's going to run the script. So let me save that, and let's go ahead and run that script. So a few things we want to look at before we run the script. Number one, I have my Ultra Workflow service turned off right now, so it's really not doing anything at the moment. Once I start the workflow service, assuming that I don't have any errors in my script, in my log file, I should see a log entry for that script, and it'll be called sample.log because that's the name of my script, sample. So I'm going to come over here and start my service, and then I come over here and I wait to see if the sample log file gets created. So let's give it a second here. So we got an error message. It says that the workflow service can't start. So we're going to do a little troubleshooting. So I'm going to click OK on this, and we're going to go over to that log folder. And since the workflow service didn't start, I should see something in the workflow service log. So let's go ahead and open that. So here's my service log. I'm going to scroll it all the way to the bottom. And you can see here we have an error message. It says there was an error loading the workflow descriptions file. The error was from system.xml because it's an XML file, so it must be using the XML libraries in .NET. And it says here that workflow start tag on line 3 does not match the end tag of workflow descriptions. It's basically complaining about a basic syntax error in my XML. So if we go back over here, you can see I opened up workflow tag, but in XML, whenever you open a tag, as you can see here, you have to have a matching closing tag. Now I think we could close it by just putting a / at the end. I think in XML that works. I'm not sure if it's going to work for this, but let's give it a try. Otherwise, we can just add a workflow closing tag. But let's see what it does. So it looks like the service started. And assuming I did this right, I have my sample script. So it created the log entry. And I can open up that log entry. Now, I'm not going to open it in, well, I could open it in Notepad++. There's my log entry. But for the purposes of when I'm writing workflow scripts, sometimes I will use this command in the PowerShell instead. So basically this command in the PowerShell, you can see that as my script runs, it's in real time, it's going to output the logging. So instead of constantly opening and closing my log files, I just let it, and you can see every 10 seconds it's dropping another log entry because it's running every 10 seconds. But if you look at this log file, you can see that we have, there's our 0, 1, 2, right? So you can see that running 0, 1, 2. It's putting those numbers in there. This is the thread type, which we called test, and then this was the first string, which is test logging, and then the second string, which says hello world. So these are our arguments, right? They're actually backwards, right? So this is the first argument. This was the second argument, and then the third argument, which is inside the tildes, which we didn't put the tildes. It does that for us. And then the fourth argument was that integer, which is the logging level. So that worked. So we're able to output some log entries. So now if we go back to our script, we can do some other interesting things. Now looking at the top of the script, right now I'm only importing 2 libraries. I'm importing system and system.io. And by the way, those are coming from, if you look over here, they're coming from this, system.dll. So that's why we have to reference system.dll. We're referencing that because that contains what we need to import those libraries for our script. If I were to take these out, I wouldn't be able to use some of these functions down here. So we already have these in here. Let's try to do something interesting with this script, see if we can work with some strings. So first, let's create a string. So in order to create a string, or create a variable, really, in VB.NET, you're going to use the dim keyword. As a general rule at Ultrarad, we like to use the L_ as the prefix for variables that are local, meaning that variable is useful inside this script, right? Or inside this function. So any variables inside my function, I'm going to prefix with L_. I could create a global variables, which would be out here, and I'll show you how to do that here in just a few minutes. So let's create something and call it patient ID. And we're going to make that a string. Actually, I'll make it uppercase so it looks nice. There we go. So we have patient ID, which is a string. Now, it could also be an integer if it only has numbers, right? So I could do that as well. So in any event, I have my patient ID. If I want to set a value for that, I can do it like this. So we'll do patient ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm going to prefix it with some zeros like this. All right, so now I have my patient ID. And if I want to output that in my log file, let's copy and paste this. Oops. And we are going to, I'm going to call the thread PID since we're working with patient IDs here. And it's really just informational, right? And we'll put here my PID is, We don't need the colon because it puts it in there for us. And instead of putting a string in here, I'm just going to reference that variable. So it should print that patient ID here in my log entry. Okay, so I declared my variable as a string. Then I set the variable, as you can see here. So I'm going to save it, and let's restart the service. And while it's restarting, we'll come over here and we'll monitor this log. And when it starts, we should see some new log entries over here. Now I don't see anything happening over here, even though the script is running. And if I come back over here, you can see the last time the script ran was at 2:39. So I suspect there may be a compile error in my script. So if you make some kind of an error when you're creating your script, if it's a syntax error or something isn't going to compile, you're going to find that error in the workflow service log. So let's open up that workflow service log, and I'm going to scroll to the bottom, and I'm going to work my way up. I'm going to look for a compile error in here. So the way I do that is I just do a search and I try to find the word compile. And you can see here it's actually running. It wasn't updating on this side. Every once in a while you have to hit Control-C for this to, it sometimes gets locked up. But you can see it's outputting my patient ID is, right? So we have it right there. So the script is working. So let's go back to our, I'm going to close the workflow config. We don't need that anymore. So going back to our script, so we have our patient ID. Now we can start doing some manipulation with strings. And by the way, one thing I want to show you is you don't necessarily have to do this in 2 lines. I could have just done this in 1 line like this. So I don't need to do 2 lines, right? So I'm declaring my variable as a string, and then there's my the value for the variable all in 1 line. You don't necessarily have to, right? So if I declare a variable as a string, but here's the problem. Take a look at what happens, right? So I'm going to take this out. So let me, and by the way, in VB, when you want to comment something so it's not parsed, right, by the parser, so it's not getting compiled, it skips it. This is where we have notes for ourselves. So you just put a single quote in front of it, which is what I did here. So now I just have patient ID as a string, and I'm going to try to pass that string that has no value into the log write event. So let me restart the service and let's see what happens. So once the service starts, I don't get an error message in the log file. So typically if something's not happening in your script log file, then we have to go look for an error in the Ultra Workflow Service log. So when I go to the Ultra Workflow Service log, by searching for compile, right? So I look for the compile thread, I see this error message. It says custom process compile error on line 18. And here's the error code. It's telling me that the variable lPatientID is used before it has been assigned a value. And that if you do this, a null reference exception could result at runtime. And in fact, there would be a null reference exception in that case. So this tells me exactly where to look in my script for my problem. So all I have to do is go to line 18, look for that variable, and try to figure out why it's being used before it's assigned. So I go in, I go down to line 18, there's my variable, and then I trace in my script and I say, oh look, there's lPatientID, but I didn't set a value, so then I fix it. Sometimes when you try to save these, it won't save if there was a compile error, so you have to stop the service first. So let me go ahead and stop it. And I don't want to reload this file, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Now I can save my script file. We're going to go ahead and start the workflow engine again. And if I come back over here and hit Control-C and start tailing my file again, we should start to see some log entries. So the last log entry is 14:44 and 20 seconds. Let's see if we get another log entry here. And we're still waiting for the service to start. Okay, service has started. And we go back over here to our tail, and we can see that it looks like, oops, Let me run tail again. And we can see some log entries. Last one was at 51 seconds. We should see another one show up here in a second. Maybe more than a second. I'll just wait for it. There we go. So it's running. So everything's running fine. So let's go back over here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the Ultra Workflow service while we make some more changes. So we can also use some string functions. So for example, there's a whole bunch of string functions in VB. And you could go, .NET Pearls is a good resource I like for looking these things up, although Microsoft does also have some pretty good resources. But I'm going to drag over to the screen here. So you should hopefully see this in the video. I've got two URLs here. This one is the official documentation from Microsoft for string functions. Right? So I'm over here looking at string functions. These are all these different things that you can do with strings. So you can certainly take a look at that. .NET Pearls is another one which has, it's a little bit easier to read the example sometimes in .NET Pearls. So for example, if I wanted to figure out how to switch the title case, right, for a string, I can click on that and it shows me a nice little example. Now in your workflow scripts, you're not going to have the, you're not going to be importing system.globalization. You're not going to have module 1, sub main. All we care about is what's in here. And we also don't have console.writeLine. Instead, we have vlog write line, right? So it's a little bit different. So sometimes you have to figure that stuff out. But here we have they created a variable called value that says .NET Pearls, and then a variable called title with some stuff in here, right? And then text info.toTitle case, right? And they pass in the value, which is this. So in any event, and then they output title. So, this is just a basic example of how to use a, some function. We're going to go ahead and try some of these functions. Let's see if we can, for example, in that patient ID, we may want to strip the leading zeros from the patient ID, right? So let's see if we can figure out how to strip those leading zeros. This is a pretty common request that we get from customers, is how to remove leading zeros, or even sometimes putting leading zeros on a patient ID. So one way that you might try to get rid of those leading zeros is to just replace them with an empty string, right? And let's take a look at that. So I'm going to just paste in an example from the documentation in VB.NET. So, and by the way, indentation sometimes counts, right? So there's a replace function, right? It's a string.replace function in VB.NET. Basically, it takes a whole bunch of arguments, the expression that you want to that you're trying to replace something in. Find is what you're trying to look for in that string. Replacement is the new thing you want to replace it with. Start is where to start. Count is how many to count. There's a whole bunch of different arguments in here, but basically I could just say find any zero and replace it with an empty string. So we could try that, right? So if I do, let's see, let me look up the syntax here. I'm going to look in the documentation in .NET Pearls. So it's actually pretty straightforward. We're just going to, I'm going to take L patient ID. I'm going to set it equal to replace. You have to spell it right, of course. So I want to look for 0. I'm going to replace it with a blank string. And my keyboard didn't like what I typed, so I'll fix that. Oops. I do have to put the right variable name in here. All right, so it's going to take L patient ID, look for any zeros, replace it with a blank string, and of course I'm going to want to output that in my log. So let's output that when we're done. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this up here because we don't need that anymore. And of course this I have to get rid of because that's just a bunch of junk. All right, now let's see what happens. So I'm going to run the script. All right, let's see if we get a log entry here. Okay, so you can see it's logging now. I do want to mention I had one minor change I had to make in the script while I had the video paused. I'm going to show you it. So you can see it's writing out. There's my patient ID, and then here's the ID without the leading zeros. Let's go back over here. So I got a compile error saying that replace was not declared because it didn't know what replace was. And the reason is because replace is a method that's in the Microsoft.Visual Basic, right? So one thing I could do, so this is how imports works. I can use this library because it's in that DLL that I have referenced in my workflow descriptions, right? Here's Microsoft.VisualBasic.dll, but the script doesn't know what I'm referring to unless I import this, right? So let's add that to my script. So I'm going to type imports and Microsoft.VisualBasic. So now that I've imported this, right, I should no longer need this prefix because it's now declared, right? So now my script's going to know about all of the methods that are available to me inside that library because it's being imported. So now that I've dropped that, let's go ahead and see if this script runs. So I'm going to come over here and we'll restart this, and I'll run this again, and let's see if it starts logging or if we get a compile error. So if I look here, you can see my last time both log files were written was 306. But let's see if we get any additional log entries over here. Yep, it looks like we are. So 1507 and 2 seconds, it logged more stuff. So you can see it's working now without having to use that full prefix. So when you see that error, that something is not declared, you might just have to have import a reference to it up here. That way you don't need to put the full the full library in the prefix. All right, so now we've done that, but here's the problem: is I'm stripping out leading zeros. But what would happen if my patient ID contained a 0 in it, right? So let's say my patient ID is 1230456. So, oops, I have to stop the service before I can save the script file. So let me save that. We'll come back over here, and we'll start Ultra Workflow. I'm just going to hit Control-C on here and start tailing my file again. And we should start to see some log entries here once this finishes starting. Oh, and there it goes. It worked. So you can see that now my patient ID is my new patient ID is 123456, but there should be a 0 in there. So this is where I have to start thinking when I'm writing a script. I have to think about, are all the possible scenarios going to work here, right? Like what could go wrong? So that solution's not going to work. I can't just do a replace. Although it seems on the surface that maybe I could do that, but that's not going to work. So what's another solution to do this? Well, we could also use an array. So I'm going to explain exactly what an array is. So in programming, an array is basically a collection of things. You can think of it as a variable that contains other variables. Another way to think of an array is it's like a table, right? So a table has rows and columns. So an array can be a little bit like a table where you can reference the intersection of rows and columns. And actually in VB, that's a hash table. There's also a thing called an array list in VB. So lots of different ways that it manifests itself. But the point is that you have a list of something, or you have a collection of things that you can work with. So in this case, what I could do, and I'm going to have to comment out these 2 lines because we know that breaks our patient ID. So instead, let's try this first. We want to process each part of the patient ID one at a time, right? So to do that, I'm going to create a new variable, and we'll call it letters, right? And if you recall, we always like to put that L underscore on the front. So we're going to try to get each one of these letters and work with them individually. So I'm going to declare that as a string. But instead of just a string, I'm going to add these parentheses on the end. The parentheses means that we're going to treat that string. That string is going to be an array or a collection as opposed to just being scalar. In other words, one value. So it's going to be a whole bunch of things in that string variable rather than just one thing, which is a scalar variable, which is our first example. So this is scalar. It can only have one value. but here we can have multiple values. And how am I going to populate that? I am going to split L patient ID. So we're going to use the split. We're going to use the split method on that string. So patient ID is a string, and one of the methods you can use on a string is split. And I am going to split on nothing, right? So that should just split it. I could split on certain characters, but if I split on nothing, I should have a collection of each letter in that string. So once I do that, now that I have, hopefully now at this point, L letters should be a collection of values. In this case, each letter from this string, from the L patient ID string. I should be able to look through each one of these. So we do that with a for each. For each is a loop, right? So for is a loop. So for each letter. Oops, L underscore letters. So for each letter, now this is a new variable, but for each letter in L underscore letters. So what's going to happen is it's going to create, this variable is going to be populated with each item from this collection in letters, and it's going to go through each one at a time. Now the problem is I can't just put L letter here. I have to declare this variable. There's two ways you could do this. I could declare it here. I could do dim L underscore letter, as a string. So I could do that. Or instead of doing that, I'll just comment this. So that would work. Or I can do it right here. I could just do L letter as string. So I'm declaring it right here as a string so I can avoid declaring it up here. Whenever you run a loop, you have to tell it when you're looping to the next item. So we're going to do some stuff and then try the next item. And then here, just to kind of show you how this works, we're just going to output these as a log line. So we'll put here the next character is, and we're going to output the next letter. All right, let's see what happens. So we're going to start this script again. So it should read each one of these letters one at a time because I'm using the split method. And it's going to loop through it with this for each. Aha, when it created the collection, it's just creating, it's not splitting it by letter. It's just, because I didn't give it a split. So let me look at the syntax here and see if there's a way to split without giving it a something to delimit the split on. Okay, so I made a little change, and I'll show you what change I made. But now I've got each letter, or each character in a separate item here. So I could work with these individually, right? Now, let me show you what I changed. I had to make one minor adjustment here. If you recall, before it was it didn't split into individual characters, so I had to use a char to do that instead. So basically, I created a variable called L letters as char instead of as string, which is a string array. So it's a character array instead of a string array. Character array is basically a collection of characters, and then I use the toCharArray method in order to do that. So I take the patient ID. And I'm using this method on that string. So this is a string. I use this method on that string, and it sets this to a collection of characters in that string. And then here I'm just looping through each one of those characters. So it's just outputting them one at a time. So now that we're doing that, now we could just put some simple logic in here that, if we start with a 0, we get rid of it. And then once we don't have a 0, we assume we're into the regular patient ID at that point. So we can strip these leading zeros. So in order to do that, we're going to have to use some conditionals, right? So this is the first time I'm going to show you a conditional. So we're going to do this. We're going to say if the L underscore letters, or letter, is equal to 0. So we want to only do this until we get through all the zeros, right? So I'm going to create another something to control the flow here. So we're going to create a variable. I'm going to call it n. I could really call it anything, right? N as integer. And we're going to set it equal to 0. So if the letter is 0, then we are going to skip this. Else, else if. Otherwise, if it's not 0, we're going to build our new ID. And of course, we have to end our if statement. All right. Now, in addition to that, so this is going to set our control, which is n. Okay. So I'm just going to output a log entry here. I'm just going to copy this. We're going to put it right here. So it's going to output that the next character is whatever. And then otherwise, it's going to output the next character, as well as we're going to set n equals 1. Okay. So when the script first enters, this is probably not the best way to do this, but I'm trying to give you a simple example here. So when we first enter this loop, if the letter is 0, we're just going to output that it happens to be 0. Otherwise, we're going to output the next character and make sure that we set n equals 1. So when we first enter into this loop, n is going to be a 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to not build our new string until n is equal to 1. So if n equals 1, I'm going to end my if here. Now, of course, we need our new patient ID, so I'm going to create a new patient ID, dim L_new patient ID as string. I'm just going to set it to a blank string. So if n equals 1, then L_new patient ID is going to be equal to, and I need to take new patient ID and concatenate to that. So the ampersand means we're going to concatenate one string to another. So we're going to concatenate to that our letter. And then we are going to output our new string. So our new PID so far, there we go. So it's going to output our new PID as it's getting built. And when this is all done, so after this loop is complete, I am going to write a log entry of our new patient ID, and hopefully it'll be the complete patient ID. All right, so let's give this a try. So just to review, before we were just outputting, looping through those characters. Now we're going to loop through the characters, and if the character is 0, by the way, I have to put quotes around this because it's actually a string, right? You always have to put quotes around the string. So if it's a 0, the next character, it's just going to output that the next character happens to be a 0. Otherwise, it's going to output what the character is and set n equal to 1. So once n gets set equal to 1 the first time, then this is going to start to run, and it'll run for the rest of that string. So it's going to skip zeros, it's going to skip 3 times because it's going to skip those zeros. Then it's going to start outputting our string until eventually it's done. And then we should have our new string. So let's take a look and see if this works. I'd say there's probably about a 90% chance that this is going to work the first try. So let's come back over here, and I hit Control C so this starts to tail our log again. And Just waiting for the service to restart. The service has restarted. And now we wait for either this to start logging, and if that doesn't start logging, then we know that we have a compile error. So I'll come over here and look for a compile error in the workflow service log. So I see there's no activity here, so this is probably a good time for me to check this service log. And again, we're going to look for a compile error, and here we have a compile error. So on line 28, so it says custom process compile error on line 28, expression expected. So there's something wrong on line 28. Let's see if we can figure it out. So on line 28, I believe that it's looking for this to be else space if. So let's see if that, oh wait, sorry. It's just else. We don't need an if on that. If you have an if, you have to have some condition when you have an if. So that was a mistake. So it's just if it's 0, then do this, else do this. Okay? So I could, if we wanted to, we could do something like this. Else if L underscore letter is not equal to 0. Then we could do something like that. But we don't really need to, right? If it's not 0, we don't care what it is. So let's stop our workflow service. I'm going to close the log file since we don't need it. Save our workflow. Try to start this up again. Hit Control Z over here so it starts tailing our log file. And let's see if we start getting some new log entries. The last one was at 1528. We should get one around 1530 once this starts. There we go. And it worked. So you can see that it loops through. So it says next character 000, and then it says new PID so far, and it starts building that new patient ID until it gets to the end, and you can see our new patient ID. And you can see the script runs pretty quick, right? It kind of flies through there. You just see that whole block of text. It's not like you see it going through the steps because it happens, almost immediately. All right, so we made a basic script that does some work with a patient ID, but here's something that frequently happens. This is a lot of, a nice little block of code right here. And when you're writing a workflow script, you want to try to concentrate in the main function, in the process function. We always like to concentrate on just the business logic of our script, not all the minutia of doing whatever it is we're trying to do. So a best practice is to use functions instead. So really what I want to do is, right here, I just want to output that patient ID without the leading zeros, or I want to work with that patient ID without the leading zeros. So I want to do it right here, right where it's needed, and not have all this code to try to do that. So we're going to make a function to do that. So here we have the end of our first function. Our first function is the process function, which gets called by workflow, but we can make our own functions below that we can call. So I'm going to create a function. So we're going to do public function. Actually, I'm going to make it a private function because no one else needs to use it. So, and by making it private, that just means it's only available. So this is a class. This function inside our class can be called from outside of this class, which is why this has to be public. But functions that I write inside my script can be private. They don't need to get used by anyone else. All right, so we are going to call this function. Let me put a capital F on here. So I'm just going to make up a name for my function. I'm going to call it, let's see, trim PID for a trimming patient ID. And the argument is going to be the L underscore PID, right? The patient ID that we're passing in. And it's going to return, so we have to return something. In this case, I want to return a string. And I think that's the right syntax. Oh, it's as string, sorry. So that's going to be our return. So we're passing in lpid as string, right? So we're passing in a string, and then when it's done, it's going to pass back a string. Then we can end our little function. And inside our function, I'm going to take all this code right here. I'm going to copy it. Or actually, I'm going to cut it. And I'm going to paste it down here. And I'm going to fix our indenting. All right. So all I have to do, all this code is in here. The only change I have to make is lpid. I'm going to set like this. So now it's going to work with lpid over here. Sorry about that. My phone was ringing. So I'm going to pass in, so we're passing in lpid to this function. So instead of lPatient ID, we're not going to have that inside this function. So instead, we're going to be working with lpid, which was passed into this function. And then eventually, down here, right? So all of this stuff can remain the same. We're going to still have our new patient ID. We're going to split our our string into the different letters, just like we were before. All of this is going to remain the same. And even down here, we're going to output our new patient ID. I really don't have to change anything, except I probably at some point want to return that string. So I'm going to, and by the way, you can see the syntax up here. There's a return here. So you can see that the process function returns a Boolean, which means true or false. So we just return true. But here, with this function, we're going to return a string. So I'm going to return this string, lPatient ID. Now, one problem is taking a look in here. Vlog is referenced inside this function, but I'm not going to have vlog inside this function because the vlog is being passed into this function, right? So I'm going to have to find a way to pass this vlog object into this other function in order to use vlog. Now, I don't want to complicate things. So let's go ahead and comment out these log entries first. Then we'll come back and I'll add this in. Actually, it really won't make much sense unless we keep these in here. So let's just go ahead and do this now. So to do that, first I have to create a new variable called something else _ log so I can use it in my other script. Although I don't technically have to do that. You know what? I'm going to do this the easy way. We're going to keep this vlog in here just the way it is, but I'm going to add this to my other function. And I think this is going to work. There we go. So we're going to add vlog to the second function. So, but now I have to pass two arguments into this function. I have to pass the PID and I have to pass in vlog. Okay. Oh, and I almost forgot I have to put by val on the front of this. I always forget that. All right, so we're going to pass in the patient ID and we're going to pass in vlog. The only reason we're passing in vlog is so we have access to that in our function. So as a rule of thumb, it's probably a good idea to write your functions this way. That way you can do your logging. And you can see here I'm going to call this thread PID, right? So it's going to be my PID logging. And up here, I'm going to change this to process. That way I know that this is something that's running from my process function. And these, I'll know when I look in the log that this is coming from trim PID because it says PID. Okay. So my next step is right here. I just have to call that function. So it's going to be trim PID. We're going to pass in that patient ID. We're also going to pass in v_log. And that should do it. So this trim PID should get called with this variable, and then it's going to output our patient ID. And that's it. So I'm going to be setting it right from the start without those leading zeros. So let's see if this works for us. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And then we're going to start it and come over here and refresh our tail. So the last log entry was 1538. I'm waiting for the workflow service to start. It looks like it just started. So now we're going to wait and see if we get some log entries over here. Or we're going to get a compile error. So let's see what happens. So let's open this up and just check and see if we got a compile error from that little change we made. There we go. We got a whole bunch of them, right? Here we have lpid is used before it has been assigned a value, and that's coming from line 15. So let's take a look at line 15. Well, that's interesting. We are assigning it a value, right? it's being assigned a value right here. So I'm not sure why it's throwing that error, but we can, let's see what other errors we got just to see. So line 27, string is not, I must have a little typo on line 27. Let's go ahead and fix that. So we'll shoot down here to line 27. That should be string. And the other error was at line 32, where L letters is being used before it's assigned a variable, or value rather. So let's go to line 32. That's strange. That is being assigned a value. So let's fix this first error up here. For some reason it's saying that, so let's try this. We can just do something like this. We'll do this the long way. So I'm kind of getting tired of opening up the script looking for compile errors. So I am going to run this command, which is going to show me compile errors in real time when the service is starting. So we don't have to keep going back and forth to that log file in these exercises. So you can go ahead and copy the syntax for that for PowerShell, but that's just going to look for the keyword compile one line at a time. So you can see right now it's showing, line 32 had that compile error. So what I'm going to do is try to start the service again and see if I get any more compile errors over here. So let's see what happens. So we're just waiting for that to start. Okay, so it's starting, or is started rather. And I don't see any more log lines over here. So let's see what the last thing logged on this side is. All right, it looks like it worked, 1545. So just moving that variable fixed it for some reason. It should have worked without it. That's one of the annoying things sometimes is, that log entry that we saw, and actually I'll go back and show you. This log entry on line 32, and also really the genesis of this is line 15. That log entry doesn't say that there is an error. It says that there could be an error at runtime. So it's just a warning, really. It's giving us an error, based on it's basically not compiling it because of a warning. It should have compiled it anyway, but it doesn't. So technically, the VB.NET code that we have in there is sound, but the compile on demand engine doesn't let it compile. So I just kind of wanted to show you that. That's kind of nice that came up, so you can see sometimes that kind of stuff happens. So we have to, use a more proper format here, or else it throws that warning. But you can see now in my actual workflow script, I have just the basic logic, just the business logic. I no longer have, all of this code down here inside that script. So it really simplifies it by using a function. So it's good to get into the habit of whenever you're doing complex operations, moving those into a function. And the advantage there too is that you can use it in multiple places. You can use it over and over again. Maybe I want to chop off leading zeros from an accession number. I can call that function to do it. It'll still work. All right, so I'm going to wrap up this video at this point. It's been almost an hour, but this should be enough for you to get started to start practicing with these scripts. You can look up some other string functions that you can try. You can try doing other basic manipulations, maybe write your own function. But we're not going to worry too much yet about external stuff. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to work with with external files. So we're going to start with files. We're going to work with files. So we're going to read files, do stuff with files, and write files. And then the video after that, we're going to work with calling commands. So we're going to use command line, and we're also going to call other libraries like the ultrarad DICOM library. So we'll work with that. So both files and using other libraries. And then finally, in the last video, I'll be working with the database. I'll show you how to interact with the database, which is probably one of the most important things that we do with workflow scripts. So that's it. So start practicing with those. You can get kind of a start with trying to work with some of the syntax with VB.NET. Maybe use .NET Perls. What will be good is to make yourself some challenges and to try some different things. That's it.